forsaken places of history, ominous and mysterious. Relics of a fallen empire, the Soviet Union. For 40 years, half the world lived under the Hammer and Sickle, a secret bunker for nuclear warheads in the middle of nowhere in East Germany. Object 73274.
Capitalism is aggressive and menacing.
Clean energy forever, the pride of the Soviet industry, Chernobyl.
The people responsible didn't know anything about nuclear energy and nuclear physics.
First an imperial, then a Soviet hospital full of secrets, the Beelitz Sanatorium.
There is no war, and so what are we doing here?
Places full of undiscovered stories, abandoned and in ruins.
Everything's been yanked out. All the machinery. Oh my God. No.
Very personal memories.
It's been 41 years now. We've grown up, just like the trees.
Under the iron fist of the Soviet Union, all of Eastern Europe becomes communist. Communism, according to Lenin, it's Soviet power plus electrification. Gigantic power plants are being built to supply the entire country with electricity. Entire cities are being founded for the personnel. Pripyat is one of these new satellite cities growing in the west of Ukraine. The nearby power plant is called Chernobyl.
The city of Pripyat was built in 1969 in connection with the nuclear power plant under construction at the time. And since the river Pripyat ran nearby, the residential area was given the same name.
From construction worker to police officer, Alexei's story has been closely linked to the nuclear power plant for decades now.
My name is Alexei Timoveevich Moskalenko. I used to live in Pripyat.
At the end of the 60s, the superpower USSR sees itself on equal footing with the West. The world's largest territorial state is home to 80 ethnic groups and divided into 15 constituent republics. The largest of them, the Russian Soviet Republic, followed by Ukraine with Kiev as the political and cultural center. Only 80 kilometers to the north, Pripyat, the youngest and reportedly most modern city in the socialist world. Alexei Moskalenko works at the construction site of the fourth reactor core. The graphite blocks he sets will bring catastrophic changes to his life and put the entire Soviet empire to the test.
The nuclear power projects were of tremendous scale and second to none in the entire Soviet Union.
For the development of nuclear power, the Soviet Union needed uranium. A socialist brother state supplies this precious resource, the German Democratic Republic. But its mountains are not only the source of nuclear fuel for power plants, but also raw material for the Soviet nuclear weapons program.
Chernobyl housed RBKM-type reactors. You could use them in two ways: bombarding uranium with neutrons to breed plutonium, and that could then be used for nuclear warheads as well.
This makes the 4 blocks of the nuclear power plant and the workers from Pripyat strategically important for the entire country.
You could say We were a part of the Soviet Union's fighting force. And the Soviet Union was leading the Warsaw Pact against NATO countries.
Both parties in the Cold War see the other as the aggressor.
Ideology, of course, played a role in saying that history is a sequence of class struggles. And in this worldview, capitalism is aggressive and menacing. This is why the Soviet Union had to protect itself. And there is this deeply ingrained experience in Soviet history that it has always been threatened by the West.
Prestigious buildings and model cities like Pripyat are shown off as heroic feats by the Soviet propaganda machine. After the completion of the nuclear power plant in 1978, Alexei Moskalenko joins the police force.
The city is small and closely knit, and that meant everybody knew everybody else. This here was the construction workers' sports facility. Competitions were held there too. If nothing else was scheduled, we, the police, would play soccer or basketball on Thursdays, often against the firefighters.
Many of the players died horrible deaths within only a few weeks. Alexei barely survived. The inspection crew of Reactor 4 was running a safety test on April 26th. They were simulating a power outage. The test spun out of control. Police officer Alexei Moskalenko was on duty near the nuclear power plant.
Then the police radio exploded with activity. When we stopped in front of the fourth reactor, one side had been completely blown out. The 70-meter tall building was reduced to 35 meters. After the explosion, black ash rained from the sky, sprinkling on my head. A stench of burnt cable filled the air.
What Alexei built with his own two hands is now highly radioactive. Floating down upon him, graphite from the reactor core.
When I came home and rang the doorbell, my wife was already waiting for me. She said I smelt so bad that I should take off my clothes right away. She put my clothes on the balcony and told me to take a shower.
This quick thinking saves Alexei's and his wife's life. But his hometown, Pripyat, is already lost at this moment. As a police officer, he supervised the evacuation and then patrolled the abandoned streets for months. In the last 2 weeks of World War II, the fighting comes to Berlin. It is the fall of the Nazi Empire. The Soviet army occupies the Beelitz Sanatorium for lung diseases. Along with the army come the refugees and the displaced. The war started from German soil. Now, many Germans from the east had to pay a high price for this. One of them is Ruth Kettner.
When I start to think back to those years, back home in Silesia, now Poland, from 45 to 47, I don't want to talk about it. We were the losers, so to speak. In 1947, I arrived in Beelitz. Together with my parents, we were deported from my home in Silesia.
Ruth Kettner worked at the steam laundry. The sanatorium is self-sufficient. From growing food to performing complex surgery, everything is done under one roof. The facilities were built between 1898 and 1930. The sanatorium is meant to help preserve social peace, because it is mainly the proletariat that suffers from tuberculosis, a lung disease.
Beelitz was selected because of its location in the middle of a huge forest with a direct railroad line to downtown Berlin, and was built as a model for all other such facilities throughout the entire German Reich.
In 1916, during World War I, a German corporal named Adolf Hitler recuperates from gas poisoning here. He's one of the reasons, and not the least of them, that the clinic later becomes part of the Soviet Union. During World War II, Beelitz is converted into a military hospital for wounded soldiers again. In 1945, 3,000 of them are transported to the West. Shortly after, the Red Army arrives at the gates.
After Beelitz had been occupied by the Soviet Army, they treated tuberculosis there, but it also doubled as a military induction center for every soldier who served in the East German Army.
Beelitz is the largest Soviet military hospital outside the USSR. Germans are hired for all non-medical jobs. The war's vanquished work for the victors.
We were used to the fact they were the occupying force. The war was over. Now we were all friends. Everything was fine and dandy.
For the first time in 60 years, Ruth Kettner returns to her old workplace. It used to be loud, hot and moist here.
They yanked everything out here. All the machines, everything's gone. Oh, God, no. This is where the rotary irons must have been. And over there they issued the laundry, where they put all the clean laundry. At the beginning, it was mostly Russian military laundry. Those thick gloves they used to have, their caps. Everything was washed and dried here.
The Soviet system is foisted upon the countries of Eastern Europe. Communists never had a parliamentary majority anywhere, but now they had power everywhere. The eastern part of Germany becomes the German Democratic Republic in 1949. The Soviet army stayed in the country as an occupying force. The Beelitz Sanatorium still offered safe jobs.
I was happy to have a steady job and get a regular paycheck.
In 1953, workers in the East rose up against the East German leadership. It's only with the help of the Soviet army that the government can hold on to its power. Millions of Germans have already been fleeing into the West since the end of the war.
9 o'clock on many a morning in occupied Germany, when the barriers are lifted between the British and Russian zones. To date, more than 300,000 people have quit the Russian area of occupation.
This wave of refugees doesn't stop after the founding of the German Democratic Republic.
Then my father left. And a couple of days, my mother followed him too. I stayed in the East, but my parents had gone.
Meine Eltern waren weg. Ich wollte nicht mehr.
I didn't want to be amongst strangers again, adapt again, begging for work. I said, no, that's it for me.
In August 1961, East Germany closes the border to the West. Escape is meant to be impossible from now on. The symbol of this separation, the Berlin Wall.
We were really devastated, you could say. We were all very sad. I wasn't able to see my parents for over 20 years. Wow,
war's.
that was it.
Ich denke manchmal
Sometimes I remember
an die
those
Zeit
days.
Heute
I
frage
think
ich mich,
that was
das
my
war nur
life.
dein Leben.
And I've lived to be so
alt
old.
geworden.
After the building of the wall in 1961, Ruth Kettner leaves Beelitz and gets married. At this point, the Soviet Union is already a nuclear superpower, with thousands of nuclear bombs and warheads. And just as in the West, they built up their arsenal of horror. The deployment of nuclear weapons close to the enemy's borders is particularly effective. That shortens the warning time and increases deterrence. The secret object, 73274, south of Berlin, plays a key role in this, built by East German soldiers.
Nobody knew what we were supposed to do here. We were only told about construction jobs here at this location.
Dieter Roland was forced into the National People's Army, NVA for short. Founded in 1956, the NVA has almost 20,000 professional soldiers. In 1962, the general draft is introduced.
The draft meant everybody had to join the army for 18 months, no matter in which unit. Well, I was a carpenter by trade, and I guess that's why I was assigned to the Corps of Engineers.
On the other side of the Iron Curtain, this new NVA gave rise to grave concerns.
NATO primarily saw the offensive war strategy of the Warsaw Pact. They missed the fact that their war plans were always predicated on a first strike by NATO. But this was just dismissed as propaganda.
The Soviet Union stations more than 500,000 soldiers in East Germany. The group of the Soviet armed forces, called GSSD, has conventional and nuclear weapons. This massive presence is not only due to East Germany's frontline position at the border to NATO.
The Soviet Union's confidence in East Germany, and in particular the NVA, was rather ambivalent. The number of Soviet troops deployed in East Germany was double the number of NVA soldiers. The NVA was always only a subordinate part by the side of their Soviet brothers.
This is reflected in the power structure at the secret construction site. Soviet officers gave orders and NVA soldiers followed them.
We didn't know the blueprints. We were only given partial mini-sections that were necessary for our jobs. So it was impossible to have any idea about the big picture of the project because of that.
The only thing Dieter Roland is able to guess is the size of the facility. On more than 150 hectares, more than 20 buildings are being built. From officers' quarters to administrative buildings. Here, in the inner circle and with access only for experts, 2 extremely hardened concrete cubes, most likely bunkers.
Every bunker was made of a single piece. Imagine making a concrete cube to sit in for safety. If the bunker were put together from several sections with seams and whatnot, in a bombing attack, those seams would be the weak spots, and the entire building would be torn apart.
Bunkers, just like political blocks, require seamless unity. A fact Czechoslovakia will have to learn the hard way in 1968. The political leadership wants to risk reforms and is backed by its people. The Soviet Union perceives that as a threat and invades the country. The Spring of Prague is to be stopped. It cannot be allowed to turn into a wildfire which spreads to other countries. The NVA is supposed to join this invasion. But that's cancelled at the last moment.
We were put on high alert, and so had to take our Kalashnikovs with us to the construction site. Then the order for military construction was given. Military construction meant you had 20 hours of work and 4 hours of sleep, and then this cycle was repeated.
The secret bunkers are supposed to be completed ahead of schedule. Now the NVA Corps of Engineers begin to realize what they are building here.
As the building grew, we slowly started to realize what it really was, as we saw the main hall with its two-floor design and then the length of the building. But nuclear weapons? No one, I think, had any idea that something like that could be stored here in those quantities.
Object 73274 is designed for mass destruction. Operational 24/7, top secret, with more than 60 nuclear warheads, each at least 5 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. Dieter Roland built death a house. Can you ever be proud of something like that?
Proud? Yes. Proud, I mean, of the achievements we all made, my buddies and I. But the purpose of the building doesn't always fill me with pride.
After his military service, Dieter Roland worked as a civil engineer. Back to the secrets of Beelitz, 50 kilometers to the north. This clinic is a symbol for the fight against tuberculosis, like no other place in Germany. Industrialization in the 19th century is responsible for formation of slums, which are a perfect breeding ground for the TBC bacteria. Berlin is no exception. The new and often densely populated workers' quarters are hit especially hard. Thousands of tuberculosis patients come from the capital to be treated at the sanatorium.
My grandma died from tuberculosis in 1927, and so did my uncle from lung tuberculosis. That is, my brother and I, we both contracted glandular tuberculosis. My name is Rosa Thielemann. I had tuberculosis in 1953, and I went to the Beelitz Sanatorium.
Tuberculosis, also known as consumption, is an infectious disease that has come in waves and exacted high death tolls for thousands of years. In 1882, Robert Koch was the first to detect the pathogen in Berlin.
The infection not only occurs in the lungs, but can also show up in other parts of the body. Lymph node tuberculosis affected mostly children and was also treated at the sanatorium, but not in the same numbers as lung tuberculosis.
I noticed that I was always tired. Tired and exhausted, and, well, my throat started to hurt. The others who were at the lung ward were, of course, worse off.
The Beelitz Sanatorium is specialized in complicated cases. Construction started in 1898. The idea, healing the workers, because only a healthy body can work. By 1930, the complex had grown to 40 buildings, an area for women and one for men. In 1942, the so-called Eiermann buildings are added, which later will remain open to East German patients. The majority of the grounds becomes Soviet territory and thus a restricted area for Germans. Not much of the medical equipment remains today. Until the 1940s, the options for treating tuberculosis were limited. Physical activity, fresh air, rest, and, if that didn't help, emergency surgery on the afflicted organs. In 1943, the antibiotic streptomycin made active therapy possible. However, the bacteria quickly become resistant to the antibiotics. Improving people's living conditions proved to be of much greater impact.
We were allowed to go for little walks in the Beelitz Sanatorium park.
Rose, then 18 years old, is healed in Beelitz, and she meets her future husband. He suffers from open lung tuberculosis. She kisses him anyway.
His kiss told me, I want you to get healthy again. That tells you a lot, what something like that can do.
The couple gets married in 1957. Thanks to vaccinations and better treatment options, tuberculosis had been pushed back in East Germany to fewer than 65 new cases per 100,000 by 1972. Today, the disease is history in most of the Western world, but globally, up to 2 million people still die from it every year. Change of scenery, the Soviet Union. For some time, it looks as if communism can create a better, more just world. But the planned economy does not run as planned. A model project of the energy sector deals a heavy blow to the Soviet self-confidence. In 1986, Unit 4 of the nuclear power plant, called Lenin, explodes. The state's leadership covers up this catastrophic accident that was never supposed to happen. It is the end for the city of Pripyat. But only few of the town folks know what's going on in the nearby power plant. A young engineer has growing doubts about the job he's doing.
I knew the reactor didn't exist anymore when I was ordered to add water. That is absolutely absurd. I called it radioactively surreal. My name is Alexei Prios. In 1986, I lived in Pripyat and worked at the nuclear power plant Chernobyl.
In 1977, after 7 years of construction, the first reactor of the nuclear power plant, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, or Chernobyl for short, is switched on. By 1983, 3 more reactors have been added. 12 reactors were planned originally. The last one is scheduled to be connected to the grid in 2010. Chernobyl utilizes so-called graphite-moderated light water-cooled reactors. Radioactive uranium pellets in graphite tubes sustain a nuclear chain reaction that generates heat. This nuclear fission is controlled by control rods. The more they're pulled out of the reactor, the stronger and hotter the reaction. The reactor is cooled with water that evaporates, driving a turbine that generates electricity.
The part of the turbine and the generator that rotates is called a rotor, weighs 120 tons and spins at a speed of 3,000 revolutions per minute. Super fast and super heavy. If the steam supply is cut off, this part keeps on spinning by itself for another few minutes.
On April 26, 1986, this is to be tested. They switch off the reactor. They want to use the residual energy of the rotor to keep the cooling water running. They also turn off the reactor's safety systems.
The engineer followed the instructions that came from the top and didn't abort the test. And here we go again. Human error. The people who ran the experiment didn't know the first thing about nuclear energy, nuclear physics. Didn't even have a clue.
The turbine slows down, and along with it, the flow of cooling water slows down too. Steam bubbles form, and they cannot dissipate the heat quite as well as water. To end the test, the control rods are lowered into the reactor again. Due to a design flaw, the control rod tips speed up the reaction instead of slowing it down. The uranium elements start to melt. The reactor explodes at 1:23 a.m. At this very moment, Alexei is still asleep. His shift starts at 8 a.m. He is asked to help in the desperate rescue operation.
The civil servants from Moscow, just like us, refused to believe that the reactor didn't exist anymore, despite the fact that we saw it with our own eyes. It was hard to accept that it had been destroyed.
The open reactor released twice as much radioactivity as the Hiroshima bomb. A lethal danger, invisible and odorless. The power plant workers are contaminated and slowly realize it.
In the evening, when I was leaving the reactor, I undressed and went into the shower. I couldn't get my right hand and my right thigh clean. The dirt didn't come off there. That didn't make me especially nervous. But I was puzzled that my entire body looked heavily tanned, other than my face, throat and hands. They were bright red, and everything that had been covered was brown.
The long-term effects of the accident have been hard to assess even to this day. Thousands die, millions fall sick. In most cases with cancer. Alexei Brois is one of them. The plutonium they breed in nuclear power plants, such as Chernobyl, ends up in the nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union. Hundreds of warheads that are deployed at secret locations in East Germany. One of these locations, Object 73274. Nuclear weapons require regular inspections and maintenance. Tricky manual work for specialists who are also employed at Object 73274.
I always tried not to think too much about how dangerous it was, and always told myself that I was doing my job as well as I could. My name is Viktor Budikovsky, and I'm an electrical engineer for nuclear weapons technology. My rank is lieutenant.
There are 80 officers and 80 soldiers stationed at the secret nuclear weapons depot. A total of several thousand Soviet soldiers, just like Viktor, work at the nuclear sites of the Soviet army in East Germany. Altogether, there are 16 such special weapons depots. In South Brandenburg alone, 120 warheads for short-range missiles are stockpiled. It's more than 1,000 in all of East Germany.
The warheads varied in yield. It was normal in the Soviet army that even the staff working on those weapons had no idea about their yield.
The Hiroshima bomb unleashes an amount of energy that is equivalent to 12,000 tons of TNT. Nuclear weapons like the ones in the south of Brandenburg are multiple times more powerful. As so-called tactical weapons, they are supposed to destroy the enemy's airfields or any advancing troops in war.
This is the manifestation of the Soviet Union's traumatic World War II experience. You first expect the adversary's attack on your owned assets. Put bluntly, on the frontline states.
The separated Germany is designated as a nuclear battlefield by both sides. Every single one of these warheads can take out an entire city in West Germany. A rigorous maintenance plan is set to keep the secret arsenal operational. Here, in the main hall of the bunker, the electronics are inspected and defective parts replaced. In case of an attack, these warheads would be hoisted to the upper level by crane and handed over to the East German missile unit.
The entire ammunition was meant for a serious attack. It was always operational and could be used at any moment. Yes, it is true. The warheads would have been handed over to the East Germany's NVA in case of an attack.
Bewaffnung der Raketentruppenartillerie in unseren Tagen. Weiterentwickelt, den neuen Bedingungen angepasst.
The East German army doesn't have its own nuclear weapons, only the delivery systems, the principle of nuclear participation.
Nuclear participation only meant that the Allied country received delivery systems for nuclear weapons. Put bluntly, they had missiles, and on the West German side, also planes. On the East German side, only missiles. The nuclear warheads, however, were under strict control of the respective superpower. That meant neither West Germany nor East Germany had their own nuclear weapons.
The range of those delivery systems only reached the River Rhine. In case of an attack, the two German armies would have to fight each other. World War III would have started as a war between Germans.
Well, the Germans in the Cold War. This is the battlefield where the future World War III was meant to be fought. And not much of Germany would have survived.
Soviet soldiers stationed in East Germany discovered a world full of surprises. Soviet propaganda has left them completely unprepared for life here.
We were taught that the Soviet Union was the most advanced of all socialist countries and stood at the highest level of communist development. And then I arrived in East Germany and realized it was all a lie.
There were many things in East Germany which back in the USSR were reserved only for the privileged. Transfers to East Germany were considered a jackpot in the Soviet army.
At the same time, people in the Soviet Union had to wait in long lines in front of bookstores or to buy toilet paper. Hard to imagine that today.
Victor and his family left the base in 1994. He found a new job in civilian life. Inside the Soviet Union, a few cities enjoy a special status. Pripyat is one of those paradise islands surrounded by a world of need. Here you find enough cars, good food, and spacious apartments.
We got this apartment on July the 20th in 1972. We lived here for 12 years. This is a big difference. Back then, everything was well kept and tidy. But to see it like this today really hurts a lot. My name is Valery Slutsky. I took the first firefighters to the airport.
The firefighters from Pripyat are at the front line of the burning reactor. They have an inkling that they are being contaminated, even if the political leadership wants to downplay the catastrophe.
They said it was just a fire, nothing more. We didn't know that the entire reactor had blown up.
Valery is supposed to drive the injured to Kiev in the morning.
On April 26, 1986, me and my colleagues drove to this building. We were charged with transporting casualties from the Chernobyl plant. To do this, the Icarus Bus 9241 was made available. And they were used to transport the casualties from the power plant.
The firefighters are weakened, are throwing up and suffering from bloody diarrhea and burns on their bodies. Radiation sickness causes delayed damage to the inner organs and disintegration of the blood vessels.
We went to the fire station at the airport and cleaned the bus because there was an unpleasant stench in it. They had all thrown up, and so we had to clean it up, and by 7 in the morning we were back in Pripyat again.
No one was told what really happened. The truth was a state secret.
On the record, it was said that there had been a fire on the roof of the turbine building between the 3rd and 4th reactor unit. That was all the people in Pripyat and the whole of the Soviet Union knew.
The government has helicopters dump tons of sand and boron on the reactor. It's supposed to smother the fire and stop the meltdown. Scientists convince head of state Gorbachev to evacuate Pripyat. 50,000 people have to leave their city, only for a short time, so they believe.
It was April the 27th. We were told it would be only for 2 or 3 days. We were told to take our papers with us. The buses arrived at about 11 a.m. To pick up the people in Pripyat. At 5 in the afternoon, the city was utterly deserted.
2 days after the explosion, on the morning of April the 28th, radiation sensors 2,000 kilometers away in Sweden sound an alarm. No nuclear incidents have been reported in the West. The Soviet meltdown cannot be kept a secret any longer.
An der Ostküste Schwedens ist in Niederschlägen eine stark erhöhte Radioaktivität gemessen worden.
Radioactive isotopes are carried on the winds going north and west. They reach regions in the Soviet Union first, Belarus and Western Ukraine, then Finland and Sweden, and a bit later, Central Europe as well. In Germany, it's mostly in the southeast, where a spike in radiation is measured. All the machines in the immediate proximity of the reactor fail due to high radiation. Now, disaster relief workers are trying to remove contaminated material at any cost. Soldiers are deployed, with no regard for their health.
We only have an official number on the casualties among the disaster workers. 30 of them died in the first few days after the accident. The unofficial numbers run up to several tens of thousands of people. Every year I bury colleagues who've died from cancer.
In 1987, Valery Sluitsky returns to the evacuated zone to help with decontamination. Today, he lives in the recently established settlement of Chernobyl, right outside the zone. Experts assume that Pripyat, Valery's old home, will be inhabitable again in 200 to 300 years. Secrecy was part of everyday life in the Soviet-dominated Eastern Bloc. That's especially true for the military. Estimates say that between 1948 and 1991, the Soviet army is on average 4 to 5 million troops strong. 500,000 of them are stationed in East Germany. Of particular importance, the specialists of Object 73274. Guardians of nuclear weapons who live here with their families.
We never talked about my father's job at home. I just knew he didn't drive a tank. Maybe he was in the artillery, but why his base was so hidden was of no interest to me. My name is Igor Gutsevich. I spent my best years here.
The secret base south of Berlin is divided into 3 zones. The restricted zone with the nuclear warheads, a barracks area, and the civilian zone for the families. Here you can find prefab housing, a library, and a little bit of private luxury in the form of a swimming pool.
We arrived here from a base in Ukraine. There we didn't have any swimming pools and no rivers, a city without any bodies of water. That's why I only learned to swim here, and I've never forgotten how.
The armed forces stationed in East Germany belong to the elite of the Soviet army. They are relatively well provided for. There are television sets and children's bicycles. The apartment blocks are well furnished and modern. A children's room and bath in every apartment, a novelty for many of the residents. However, there are some special features.
The base commander and his family lived in one of the houses. His deputy lived in a similar apartment, but at the other end of the hall. I believe the idea was that, in case of a bomb, at least one of them would survive. Makes sense somehow. Here was the entrance. Couple of steps up. To the right, apartment number 8. Along the corridor, and on the left here was my room. My own room, for the first time in my life. Yeah. That was 41 years ago. We've grown up just like the trees.
In January of 1991, the last Soviet soldiers leave Object 73274 and return home. The living situation there is a rude awakening.
We estimate that about 2,500 people used to live here, soldiers and their families. Many of them share their memories on social media. For many of them, those were the best years of their lives. So it couldn't have been so bad.
Today, Object 73274 is owned by a building materials company. Most buildings have been torn down and converted into gravel for road building. The Beelitz Sanatorium has been under Soviet management since 1946. With 1,200 beds, it is the largest military hospital outside the Soviet Union. This makes the new masters of these grounds the heirs to the Prussian architecture of splendor. Even today, some are still mesmerized by this greatness.
From the first moment I came here, I was absolutely amazed by the architecture of these buildings. Everything looked quite orderly, but seeing this now, I am speechless because everything is totally destroyed. I am Lydia Hennig, and I used to work as a laboratory doctor here at the Express Lab.
Be it complicated births, the wounded from Afghanistan, or patients with radiation sickness after Chernobyl, Beelitz Sanatorium was equipped to handle everything.
The rare disorders that couldn't be treated at smaller military hospitals in East Germany were sent to Beelitz.
Under Soviet control, the hospital, just like all other bases in East Germany, is kept state-of-the-art. The costs were staggering. In 1986, head of state Mikhail Gorbachev starts with long overdue reforms. In 1988, Gorbachev convenes a conference on the Warsaw Pact. The task at hand is cutbacks, even in the military.
Auf dieser Konferenz wurde die vom sowjetischen Partei- und Regierungschef Michail Gorbatschow durchgesetzte grundlegende Änderung der für den Warschauer Pakt verbindlichen strategischen Konzeption besiegelt.
We had always received double wages. We were paid in East German mark, then in West German money. And we received another paycheck in the Soviet Union, going into our bank account there.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 made the Soviet troops' presence in East Germany uncertain. One of the last actions of the Soviet Union as a protective power is granting Honecker asylum.
Der frühere DDR-Staats- und Parteichef war im April ins sowjetische Militärhospital Beelitz eingeliefert worden.
In March 1991, Honecker flees to the Soviet Union, a country that will cease to exist only 9 months later. And the Soviet troops stationed in East Germany are preparing their final drawdown from the promised land of East Germany.
Among us, we always assumed that the Soviet army would return to Russia. The entire hospital, with all its equipment and staff, officially went back to Russia.
The destruction you remember today when you think of Beelitz actually happened after 1994, through dismantling, vandalism, and neglect of the facility for many years.
Whatever is left of the equipment, no matter if from the days of the Kaiser or the Soviets, is stolen. Lydia does not return to Russia with the other staff. She found a new home in Germany.
I often thought why the Soviet army was stationed on German territory, because there was no war. So what were we doing here? And honestly, deep down in my heart, I was very happy that this occupied territory was given back to the German people.
In 2015, the first treetop path in Brandenburg is opened at the Beelitz Sanatorium. Sections of the clinic have been converted into residential buildings. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. Only memories and some very unique places harken back to the former empire. Old weapons depots have fallen apart. Pripyat might be inhabitable again in 200 years. And the Beelitz Sanatorium has a new purpose in life.